Keeping everything simple, let's talk about the balance between life and career. Your job should be a source of fuel in your life, and there's two ways I think this should take form. So it's gonna either end up being a source of monetary fuel, so it's able to pay for your bills, or it's a source of personal fulfillment fuel, so the job that you do in some capacity fuels your sense of joy, satisfaction, and curiosity. Welcome back to the Keeping Everything Simple podcast. I'm your host and fellow learner, Michael Klucas, and on this show, we boil down complex topics into simple, actionable tips. So ultimately, when I'm talking about life and career, it's the fact that your job should not be your life. And so I want to dive into that piece a little bit more first. Life is meant to be lived, and in that capacity, this is something I mentioned on the podcast before, in different videos before, and I'll say it again, is that you work to live, you don't live to work, because you shouldn't be thinking about and always on the clock essentially for work. You shouldn't only be dedicating your time and effort and energy to work. When I say that your life is your own to be lived, that just means that your job should not be all consuming. It shouldn't be the thing that takes up 95% of your day and your mental energy. I know Gary Vee talks about some of this stuff as well on his different shows and appearances and everything, where it's the idea that if you hate what you're doing, if it's abusive, if it's toxic, if it's just so draining, you have no interest, no passion for what you're doing, leave, quit. Move into a direction in a field that makes more sense for you. And I do subscribe to that notion in the sense that you should be finding some balance between what you're doing for work and then how you're leading your life, because ideally you want to find something and do something that you're curious about, while at the same time you're able to get paid for in some capacity. And it doesn't need to be like your complete and total passion. And I'll get to that in a little bit later on in the video and the podcast. As I mentioned, the idea that your job is taking up like 90% of like your life or your mental energy, your mental capacity, whatever it is, that's not a sustainable, way to exist and a sustainable way to be. Because there was a joke about this based on another internet creator who had emphasized that, nothing in nature is really ever truly moving 100% output all the time. That's not efficient, and also is just one way to wear yourself down even faster. For yourself, you're multidimensional. And so the idea of going in 100% all in on just one thing doesn't actually work. It doesn't address essentially all the other pieces of who you are and all the things that make you you. This is something that often does get joked about in some capacity, because from what I have seen, there will be plenty of comedians make the joke of like, at some point I'm talking with my younger friends who are in our 20s and we're talking about, we're traveling and we're doing this class program or this degree program, and then at some point the transition turns to, I do this or I do that, and this is my job and this is what I do for, work. And there's a realization that a flip was switched where who you are becomes what you do. And in some aspects that's okay, because we naturally are working towards a sense of purpose, sense of fulfillment, and having stuff to do does feed into that. But it shouldn't be the only thing that you're able to talk about and able to claim as an integral part of who you are. And now, as I'm talking about the idea between the balance of life, work, your own personal identity, and self-fulfillment, there are a fair number of issues that would obviously come up that would be conflicting between trying to do something that you want to do and then taking care of responsibilities and taking care of business essentially. And obviously that first one being, it's the idea of like, well, I have to pay bills. This is only a means for me to pay bills. That aspect is by no means a problem, because as I said, you work to live And so that means your job is fueling your life. However, again, it's taking that a little bit further and re-emphasizing it's about fuel. If you're going to a job that you're so stressed out about that it's deteriorating your personal relationships, your friendships, it's consuming your thoughts, there's a lot of stress, there's anxiety, there's burnout, there's breakdowns, whatever it is, and you're still trying to stick to it because it just pays the bills, that's a point that you need to probably reevaluate. And I'd highly recommend you reevaluate for your own sense of security and your own sense of how is this all going to work out in the end. Because the idea of using a job to pay your bills is normal. That's okay, and that's a good thing. It's still about finding and striking some sort of balance so that way you're not just succumbing to that routine where it's day in, day out, or the worst outcome of this, succumbing to the overall pressure of like, I can only do this, I can only be this because it pays the bills, it supports the lifestyle I have right now, and I'm too scared to jump to something else or to move in a better direction. You need balance in your life, and for that as well, you need a decent job. And that's different for everybody. So what might be a decent job for me that meets a certain amount of criteria, a certain baseline, may be completely different for you. So take that with a grain of salt, but do understand that the premise stays the same no matter who you are. Your own basic baseline needs and what makes a good job for you is something you need to get clear on. Another big barrier would be the idea of, if I want to get out of this job, I don't know what else to do. I don't know what other things would be interesting for me to want to go do. Honestly, this isn't so much a solution, so much as encouragement for me to tell you, explore things. Take time and just run through a lot of trial and error. Don't feel like, again, you're stuck in one position because there is a certain standard of living you're used to, or because of everyone else around you trying to keep up with the Joneses. It's instead, again, exploring and trying to get a better understanding of where are your interests? What do you actually like doing? That feeds into the positive loop of, okay, maybe that becomes a source or a pillar in your life that allows you to think, okay, I'm able to make adjustments in my job. Maybe I made a lateral move to a different department and I'm still in the same pay range, but it's more closely aligned with an interest. Or you've done some testing outside of work where maybe you are trying out small businesses online. Maybe you are getting involved with different clubs and community activities, just things that are pushing the boundaries that you hadn't done before or you used to do and hadn't done for a while. It's revisiting kind of those old interests as a stepping stone to see, how can I use these interests, or how can I essentially employ and embed these interests into what I do today. Talking about that comes with a lot of risk, not the idea of like jumping jobs and like jumping ship, but just ultimately change is not something that we like. For a lot of us, change is very scary, causes a lot of anxiety, and even those who are comfortable with change, it still causes some anxiety. And there was a great episode on Cal Newport's podcast, which I highly recommend, I'll link it down below, about the idea of homeostasis, returning to a state of normalcy. However, normal is going to change consistently throughout the years, throughout time, because the pandemic, and this is something he goes over with his guest in the show, the pandemic was a great example of this, because there was the normal beforehand, so everyone's pretty much going into the office, there's a lot of in-person, on-site work being done, and there's a certain expectation that goes with that. The pandemic flipped all that on its head for so many people and for so many companies, and now there was that push to get back to what we were doing before, to get back to this idea of, okay, we need to return to all hands on deck in the office, on-site only. And that ignores the idea that our normal now is different. It's new. So the homeostasis that we're going to find ourselves in is going to be a new combination of on-site, hybrid, remote, and still productive work. Even understanding that it still is scary to take the leaps of faith that you want to do. And this doesn't even have to be some huge life shift. It can be followed by one, sure, but it doesn't have to be so in the moment. And it also comes with understanding that progress is not always linear. So the idea that we can only ever go forward is kind of a misconception, especially in terms of realigning ourselves with what makes the most sense for us. Instead, think of it more as a spiraling arrow that's moving forward. But when it's a spiral, that means you may start in one area, you may go beyond that, but at some point come back to it, and that in itself may feel like a step back in the moment, but ultimately is still progress moving forward as you're figuring things out. A great example I have for this is the fact that throughout the job hunt I've been doing for the past couple of weeks here, I do have a new job lined up, which is fantastic. I'm excited for it. And at the same time, I'd also reapplied back to the old company I'd worked at when I was in manufacturing. And the thing was, I wasn't going back into manufacturing. I was applying for HR. I was applying for a new department. So technically, this is where that spiral comes in. I had left it and gone to something new. And then I came back to it with an application, which I haven't heard back from. But it's still an example of how I'm trying and observing that I went from someplace and took a step forward. And even if I'm returning to the same setting as before, I'm still making progress. Another example that a lot of people, especially within my generation, Gen Z and millennials, are very familiar with is the idea of moving back home with your parents. That's something that for our older cohorts, they may look at and think, why would you do that? That's such a step back from all the progress you've made, when instead it can possibly be one of the smartest financial decisions that a young adult can make. It may not look the most, lavish and like we're stepping out into the world on our own. However, it's a trade-off that we're choosing to make, or a decision that we're choosing to make, because it's going to propel us forward in a better standing and a better route. Talking about interests, jobs, and careers, I want to dive into kind of like the 4 tiers to this of using your interest, because we're going to go over then hobbies, jobs, career, and vocation. And I'm going to keep it very simple, because the in-depth analysis for all these probably could be its own episode, its own podcast for each and every single one, just because there's so much that goes into it. But the tier list to me is played out like this. So a hobby is where your interests are being developed. Hobbies are for fun, they're for enjoyment, they're for excitement, whatever it is, but you need to have some form of hobbies, and that's going to look different for everyone, because these hobbies help kind of spice up your life. They help you find out other interests that you might have, or even just get deeper into the ones that you currently already know very well, but you just want to keep developing. And that is where the idea of living your life can really come into play. And that's what the hobbies are. The job is things that pay the bills, keep the lights on, keep food on the table. It's a step up in which ideally you'd want to find a job that you're interested in and passionate about, and that's the ideal circumstance. But if you have a good set of hobbies that fuel you, they fill you up with excitement, empowerment, enjoyment, then having a job that can fuel those hobbies, then that's a good combination, as long as that job is something that you feel is a good character fit for who you are, and not one that you are just in because you have to, again, keep appearances, but it's meeting the needs that you have for your current chapter and current stage of life. This is something new that I'm kind of introducing, but at the same time, it's not a new idea by any means. It's the idea that a career So the next tier up is only a series of experiences and jobs. That's all it is. But ideally, it's a more long-term goal and long-term picture and understanding of what it is, because you are passionate about your career. And so what I mean by this is, again, the ideal circumstance for a job is that you would have something that you're interested in, that you're passionate about, and you're able to continue along a string of jobs that each one kind of builds on top of the other. And then you look back and that happens to be your career. However, you can kind of be more intentional about it and say, all right, I want to have a job that helps people. I want to maybe go into HR, maybe I want to go into counseling, maybe I want to go into the public service sector and work as a civil servant, whatever it is. It's then looking at the career trajectory and thinking, how are my jobs leading me closer and closer to that long-term goal? And now this is where it gets a little bit more confusing, in which you have the career, which is kind of, again, the jobs that you hold and the purpose that you're looking for. But then vocation is your calling. And so whether that is something that if you subscribe to the Christian aspect of it, it's a God-given gift, or just a natural inclination and ability in your zone of genius, in your zone of excellence. But it is something that you feel inclined and called to do, and something that you may not actually be the best at it in the moment, but it's something that you know that you want to evolve in, develop in, and use those skills. And so that's where it's a step above career, because a career is interest and passion, but the vocation that you have, that is the calling, the thing that you know you want to ultimately be doing. And that can take so many different forms. And that's how the tiers kind of all stack together, in which you have the hobbies to spice up your life, the job to fuel the hobbies, the career to have that sense of fulfillment, and then the vocation to truly understand how you are using your gifts in the world. And even with that explanation of hobbies, job, career, and vocation, it still all ultimately comes down to, what do you feel is best for you? Because what works for me, what makes the most sense for me, is not going to be what resonates and what works for everyone else too. It's definitely not a my way or the highway type of thing. And this whole journey of career development, this whole journey of job discovery and vocational rediscovery that we all have to go through at some point in our lives, is a unique journey for each of us. That's what makes it so important that we do take time to actively balance out our lives and our professional pursuits. Because if we are allowing our professional pursuits to take precedence over our lives, and that we neglect to actively build and foster and maintain a healthy lifestyle, then we may miss things like our hobbies. We may miss things like a clear opportunity to follow our vocational calling more, or we may even get stuck in careers that we don't love, that drain us, that we actively wish we could get out of. And this is something that while working as a recruiter, I was being told a lot about, where some people had ended up in a field, in a career, not because they chose to, but simply because that is just how their life played out. And to them, it seemed like it was out of their hands, as opposed to an intentional decision of, I want this job and that job and that job, and to move up a certain progression in a career that makes sense, as opposed to just falling into one and then from there having no say on what they do next. It's where that balance between career and life can go wrong, and you want to avoid feeling like someone else is, again, driving the car and directing where you go. And again, it's understandable that if you are thinking about changing a job, changing some aspect of your life, that there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty that follows that. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue it. It just means getting clear on the reasoning and the why behind that change and what motivates you to do so. Because if you are moving jobs to get closer to your ideal career, and then that career is also bringing you one step closer to what you feel is your vocational calling, then from there, that is a good change to make. And it's always going to feel scary in the moment. But again, if you do nothing, then ultimately nothing will change. If you allow yourself to get pulled along by the current of life, the current of careers, the current of other people's decisions, and don't make any of your own, you will end up in a position where you look back and are suddenly confused by how the last decade, 2 decades suddenly got away from you. And I don't want you to feel like what you're doing is out of your control. I want you to feel like the decisions that you make, the career that you're leading, are ultimately your own decision because they're ultimately your interest, your passion, and your callings. And all these stuff is also subject to change because we may sometimes have an idea, but we may not have the right idea. And sometimes it just means realigning, readjusting, and trying again. You can make any of the changes that you want to your life, to your job, to your career, and all of it comes from that mindfulness of who you are and that self-awareness of where do you want to go, being clear again on the reasoning behind everything. So I encourage you, no matter what stage of your career you're in, no matter what job you're in, to reassess and reevaluate what that balance of your life looks like between interest, passion, hobbies, job, career, and vocation. Take a look at it, take a moment, and just assess what direction are you going and how and why are you going in that direction. Make sure you guys comment down below what's been your career path so far. What is your ideal career path as well? And are you living that right now? Keeping everything simple. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you like this podcast and subscribe to the channel. It helps the channel grow and other people discover it. If you listen to it on a podcast app, then be sure you leave us a rating so that way, again, more people can discover the show and we can talk to more people about leading the best life possible and taking simple action. With that, keeping everything simple, have an amazing day, you amazing people, and I will see you all in the next episode.